G'day and welcome to the Drive Able podcast, where we discuss all things about driving and safer community transport for people with disabilities and medical conditions. If you haven't done so yet, make sure that you go back and subscribe to our channel and follow us on our socials. Just search for Drive Able podcast and it'll come up with heaps of content and interviews that we've done so far. Go back and listen to some of those older episodes. Follow our channel, press the like button, smash the subscribe button, and make sure that you tune in every week to our podcasts. If you've got a story to tell about driving or transport, or you know somebody that has a story to tell, make sure you get in touch with us. Hit us up with a comment on our social pages, and we'll make sure that we get back to you. Ali, how are you today?
Hey, Brad. Yes, I'm great. And we have another wonderful interview here. Today we have Amin Akbarian back again for another interview. You might remember Amin is Australia's representative on the International Standards Committees for Assistive Technology Products. Basically, this is a very important role because the Australian standards are like a copy of the international ones, and Amin basically makes sure that our voices and requirements are heard on that international standard and on that international scale. So his role is really important. Once COVID and all that dies down, it is a fairly international role. He'll be traveling overseas and contributing to those meetings overseas. After the last time we got Amin out, we gave, at the last time we got Amin out, we gave an overview of all the standards. And now basically we've got him back to talk specifically about each standard. So what we're going to do is go through an episode on each one, or maybe a part A and part B. We'll explain it as we go along. There's quite a few standards, and I guess it can get quite in depth. So we're going to leave it fairly flexible. We're going to cut it up in a way that people can understand, and we'll just keep going there like that.
Yeah, so just to help highlight before we get into it, there's four main standards. There's one to be able to get in and out of the vehicle with ramps and hoists and lifters. There's one about the actual standards of the wheelchair, of when that's actually in the vehicle. So what standards does the wheelchair actually have to be if you're going to be sitting into that? And then there's another standard about how to actually tie that down and restrain it. And then there's another important standard about driving with hand control. So things that impact on steering or the pedal control or other secondary functions in the car. So they're the four main standards that we're going to go through with Amin. Today's session is about the tie downs and the securing of the wheelchair in the vehicle. So if we're ready, let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
Driving is something many take for granted, but when someone has altered ability, then driving or getting out and about in your own car can be challenging. Driving with a disability doesn't mean you have to drive an old clapped out car with farm-like machinery, and relying on a wheelchair doesn't mean waiting for hours and then being in the back of a maxi access cab getting car sick. The Drivable podcast is designed to introduce and explore driving aids for people with disabilities, vehicle modifications, the NDIS, research, medical guidelines, driving techniques, and much, much more. The Drivable podcast is to help you be informed and be in control of your own independence so you can experience freedom through driving safely and reliably. I'm Ali, and with me is Brad, and together we have over 30 years of experience in disability and driving. Enough of the intros, let's get into it.
Okay, in this episode, we're back talking with Amin Akbarian from the International Standards Committees representing Australia. Amin, tell us a little about yourself, where you're basically another reintroduction.
Yep. Yeah, so hi, I'm Amin Akbarian from Mobility Engineering, a company based in Sydney. I'm the CFO and vehicle solution specialist within the company. My background of, education is mainly around business, finance and accounting, but also done Certificate 3 in automotive manufacturing. So had, hands-on experience in the workshop as well, actually installing and developing some of these products as well. The industry experience, I've been in the disability industry for about 15 years around product supply and solution prescription. And I'm an independent member on the Standards Australia Committee, ME 067, which deals with the standard we're going to be talking with today, and a couple other standards within the vehicle disability area. Expert member on the ISO WG6, so that's representing Standards Australia on the similar standards that we work within in ME 067, and focus group member for Transport New South Wales for vehicles modified for people with disabilities. And on top of that, work, I guess, fairly closely with the industry representation bodies, ATSA and ARADA, to provide advice to the general public when issues around vehicle modifications or questions are asked in that area. So yeah, I've been in this industry for a little while now, showing, I think, by some of the grey hairs you might be able to see.
At least you've got hair. At least you've got hair. If there's a bit of a shiny reflection on the screens for the people when they watch Ali and I on YouTube, but at least you've got some hair, even if it is a little bit grey. Hey mate, we did an interview with you a while ago. I just want to prompt people to go back to listen to that interview. And that interview, we did an overview of the standards. And this time, what we're doing is we're going to break that down. One policy, one procedure, one policy at a time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So just
forgive me if I'm going to be switching. Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say I might switch a little bit between screens because I've got my note on one and the other one. So
yeah, that's all good.
Might drift.
And just to reiterate, what the aim is with this is, as mentioned before, there's 4 standards that are relevant to our industry. They're very important as an end user, as a therapist, as an industry professional, modifier, whatever. It's very important that you're actually aware of these. They do have a strong effect. There has been sort of anecdotal comments in the past about things like standards aren't enforceable or standards aren't important and so on. Those things aren't actually true. All of these standards are all required. They're all very important. The thing is that this disability space pre-NDIS, as you've seen in a lot of our interviews, didn't really exist that much. So there wasn't much attention. So people were just doing things without complying with standards, thinking like it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't. And so when this is why we're doing this, because this information is very important. We're seeing in the industry and on the field, I know I'm seeing as an engineer, left, right, and center people that are not hitting the standards purely because they didn't know that they existed, or they didn't realize how important they were, or how they were all legally required and so on. So the idea with what we're doing here is we're going to follow, I guess, roughly the same format for each standard to keep it fairly consistent as well. So we've got about 4 or 5 different kind of key points we want to cover per standard. And then each episode will do that at the same points for the standard. So then it's some point of reference and comparison. And you can actually, I guess, use this podcast as a bit of a tool into the future as well. So that's kind of the idea of what we're trying to do moving forward. And I guess we can kick it off with the first one, which is around, one of the ones we're going to talk about now, not necessarily the first one, but tying down the vehicle. So, or tie downs in the vehicle. And this is probably one of the most prominent standards that is talked about in Australia, I guess, from the engineering space. So, so give us a little bit of information. What's the standard number and what's the name and what does it represent?
Yeah. So yeah, this standard is ASNZS 10542. So 10542, I guess, is the main heading of the standard. And then there's point 1 and point 2, which is the different areas for testing and the prescription. The name of the standard is Technical Systems and Aids for People with Disability, Wheelchair Tie Down and Occupant Restraint Systems, Requirements and Test Methods. So, yeah.
Amin, for our listeners, can you provide us with a link of where they can actually find this? Now, we know that they're not for free. I think you need to pay to download them. But it might be a worthwhile investment for an OT or for a vehicle modifier, or even a client if they've got a vested interest in this area. At the end of all of this, will you provide us a show note of where we can actually get this from?
Yeah. So they're all available from SAI Global, but I'll put a link there for everyone so they'll be able to have a downloadable.
And I actually want to just add a little bit more to that. a little bit more, which may turn into a bit of a rant, but because I guess we've had often industry professionals such as OTs ask us and want free copies of the standard. You're getting a couple of $100 an hour, guys, and you're getting paid for this. It's your job to have a copy of that standard and buy it. So that's the requirement for your job. So you have to go and buy it. That's part of the job, you know. So asking for free copies of standards or not keeping a copy of the standard means you're not being competent at your job. You are prescribing these things on behalf of NDIS. The requirement is that you have a copy of that and you go and buy a copy of that. So rant over, but yeah, it's something that we get often requested. Oh, can't we just get a free copy? It's so expensive, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just sitting there going, but it's part of your job that you have to go buy the standard. So just go buy it. It's not that much money compared to what you earn. So yeah, that's my little 1 and 2 cents about owning those.
And it is a little bit important in regards to these standards, especially with sort of what Ali was mentioning a little bit earlier, but to just build on it slightly, is in this industry, it happens, I guess, in a lot of industries. It's not just only our industry that it happens with, but when it comes to product prescriptions and I guess recommendations for how they should be fitted, whether it's within a vehicle or in the outside world for handrails and so on, it has sometimes become an opinion-based conversation and not a fact-based conversation. So when it comes to standards, you can't, I guess, take someone's word for it or an opinion. It has to be exactly as per what is written in the standard. As we'll sort of cover it a little bit later in this episode, especially with this one, it is mandatory to meet because it's cited within legislation. So it's not a non-compulsory standard, but we'll cover that later. So it is very important to have a copy of it for that reasons, just to make sure you've cleared the air and know exactly what to comply with and what not to comply with.
Right.
So yeah, so this standard covers two areas within the vehicle. One is it's all to do with occupant safety, but one is to do with the restraints that will hold an occupant safely inside the vehicle, and the other part is the restraints that's going to hold the wheelchair safely into the vehicle. So both parts are entwined into this standard, and they're sort of combined as what the industry sort of acronyms as WTORS, which is the wheelchair tie downs and occupant restraint systems.
Fantastic. So this is all about securing somebody in the car seat, and that's what you're going to get into in this one. And you've already mentioned that it's compulsory, but what are the main parts of this standard that we need to really consider and understand for moving forward?
Yeah. So when it comes to, I guess, especially the area that we're working with in predominantly within the NDIS, the key term used for, I guess, a lot of these solutions within the vehicle is assistive technology. And the areas of assistive technology that this would relate directly to is the wheelchair itself. And then the other part is the vehicle itself. So we're sort of two separate parts, and what we're trying to do is match them together to make sure we're going to have like a safe outcome for the occupant. The areas of this standard which probably need to be highlighted the most, I'll probably split it into two though, like the wheelchair restraint part and then the occupant part, and highlight sort of separately. So from the wheelchair side of things, what we want to know is the distances required, for example, for restraints. There's set requirements within the standard that tell you how far your restraints need to be apart from each other to then fall in line with the tie down points of the wheelchair. There's also width requirements to then take into account multiple different sizes of wheelchairs and whether it's a manual chair, a power chair, and so on. There's height requirements as well, which will then come into the sort of occupant side of things. But yeah, from a wheelchair point of view, we want to know weight of the chair. We want to know the tie down situation of that chair. And we want to know the overall size of that chair. So I guess this is also one good point to think about, when you're dealing with modifiers or vehicle modifiers, if they're not asking you those three questions, then you should probably, I guess, consider maybe looking at some other modifiers. However, they're very, very important and must be achieved to be able to get a safe outcome. So you need to know the weight of the chair. The reason why you need to know the weight of the chair is in this standard, just meeting this standard, which is the standard test requirements you have to do, are for 85 kilo restraints. So if the question isn't asked of how heavy is this chair, or how much does this chair weigh, there's a high chance that you could be overloading the restraints within the vehicle if they only just meet Australian standards. This is an area that's, I guess, being highlighted a lot right now within the industry and is becoming a bit of a talking point because a lot of people are going back and figuring out that there's a lot of chairs in vehicles with underrated restraints in there. So very, very important to know the weight and match it then to the right weighted restraints. Yep.
Can I just ask a question in regards to that? The tie downs themselves, is it the 85 kilo restraint? This is a question that comes up with OTs. Is each restraint 85 kilos and you add that up to the total weight of the wheelchair, or is it each restraint needs to be able to take the weight of a wheelchair? Because so let's take a power wheelchair as an example. A power wheelchair may be around 160 kilos, just the wheelchair itself. Well, let's say 150 for round numbers.
Yeah. So the way that they're tested are in combination. So they're not individually tested. So all four are hooked up to a surrogate wheelchair, crash tested, and then they're rated. So it's a combination of all four. So that would be that 85 kilo rating. Now, that doesn't mean that there's only 85 kilo rating wheelchair restraints out there. It just means that just the standard wheelchair restraint is most likely going to be 85 kilo rating. If your wheelchair is heavier than 85 kilos, you will then need the appropriate wheelchair tie down that's going to match that weight. Now, there are multiple different manufacturers. I won't name sort of manufacturers, but there's multiple manufacturers of restraints that do go all the way from 80 kilos to 200 kilos now on the market. So they are available. The area where we're seeing a little bit of, I guess, issues in the market is the hooks of the restraints for the heavy duty chairs are quite large because they need to withstand such a high force, and the tie down brackets on the wheelchairs to take those are not big enough to be able to fit those hooks. So it's maybe just a simple miscommunication between wheelchair restraint manufacturers and wheelchair manufacturers themselves, but that's what we're finding to be one issue when going to the heavy duty restraints at the moment. There are things that can be done like using strap loops, for example, to make up for that position, so that you've got another point to pick it up from. But that's one thing, I guess, just to highlight for the larger chairs. And this is why, I guess, the NDIS protocol of trialing is quite important as well, to make sure that the chair you've got is going to match the restraints needed.
So one of the questions we had was those strap loops. Do they need to be rated? I'm assuming that they would have to be rated up to 200 kilos if it's a 150 kilo wheelchair as well.
Exactly. So there are local suppliers here that supply wheelchair restraint manufacturers, and the loops that they send, they are rated. Sometimes it sounds a bit ridiculous, but sometimes you might have to use 2 loops, for example, on the one point with the heavy duty restraint to be able to satisfy the 200 kilo requirement. That's something that I guess we have brought it up. I know wheelchair manufacturers are looking into that and working on making those transport points bigger. Some already have started introducing that, but that's going to be just something that could be a bit of a sticking point moving forward. So the weight, so weight is extremely important. At the moment, 200 kilos seems to be the limit of what we're at in terms of a securement inside of a vehicle. In general, once you're going over 200 kilos, there are other things that start coming into play with the vehicle's floor strength itself, and so on and so forth. So 200 seems to be that cutoff mark at the moment.
Just one more question from the OTs that I'm working with. Does this count the weight of the client on the chair? So are we just talking the weight of the wheelchair only, or are we talking about the person in or on the wheelchair as well when it comes to tying down the wheelchair only?
So for the moment, I'll keep it simple. It is just the weight of the chair and not the occupant. But I guess a little bit of a hint of what's going to come into the future is there are chairs now being developed with inbuilt seatbelts, and they're becoming a testing nightmare, I know, for wheelchair manufacturers and wheelchair restraint manufacturers. But once that gets introduced, it's going to be a little bit different. So there's going to be a very different setup within the vehicle in terms of how the restraints are rated, and that will then have to then start taking into account occupant and mobility device weight. But at the current time, with what we have available within the standards, it's separating the occupant weight from the chair itself.
So just to break that down for listeners that are listening into this, we're talking about restraints for the wheelchair, and then you have a seat belt on top of that, which we're going to get into in a little bit more detail later on. They're two separate items. So one, you tie down the wheelchair, and then you have a seat belt to restrain the client in the wheelchair to make sure that they're safe. So it's an important mind concept to get around. And a lot of people, a lot of questions that I get are around those from clients, but also from OTs as well, is that seems to be one of the main mental mindsets that people need to get themselves sorted in their head to be able to figure out which part of the standards are we actually looking at here.
Yeah, I also on that, what I found was basically the words is hard to put together, but from I guess what's happening is when people are out there on the field, that I guess this really highlights that point that we've made in other videos and things like that, that the seatbelt comes off different points. It's not on the wheelchair. So, so I guess it's a big, I'm trying to bring it, the point I'm trying to get across is when you sit on the chair, that chair is already 200 kilos. And if I'm 100 kilos on top of that and I'm relying on those tie down points, then that's 300 kilos that's going to be putting the force on those tie down points, right? And so it's very important, I guess, to visualize the thing that's holding the person in is a completely different system to what's holding the wheelchair in. And we just have to understand that they're two different things, because it is, yeah, like a common thing that I come across when I'm doing the engineering, when people don't really understand that difference. And yeah, like and also I guess there's not really anything, typically when you look at those wheelchair bases, there's not really anything that's tying the seat down. Normally they're kind of just the base, right? That's being tied down. So you do need something that ties the occupant in. And I guess I just wanted to highlight the fact that the thing that's tying the occupant in is a different system. Like it's bolted to different parts of the car. It's not connected to the wheelchair. It's not connected to the tie downs. It's not related to that stuff. So, so yeah, it's a whole different system.
Yep.
So,
yeah,
are there other things? Are there other things to talk about in regards to tying down the wheelchair?
Yeah. So other than weight, it's the physical size of the chair itself. So again, I might actually maybe touch on the compulsory side a little bit. When it comes to a standard being compulsory, especially within the wheelchair occupant and restraints area, there's a different allowance for private vehicles as there is for public vehicles. As you can imagine, if you've got a private vehicle, you've got a set size occupant within there, so you can maybe lax some of the requirements, and they'll still be transporting safely. In a public vehicle, we can't lax any of the requirements because we don't know who the next occupant's going to be that's going to be entering this vehicle. So we've got to assume for the largest. So the other area is size. So mainly for private vehicles, we want to know what the overall wheelchair size is, and the distances between the restraint tie-down points on the wheelchair. So then we can put the restraint points in the floor within the requirements of the standard. So that's where there is a little bit of leniency. So there is the standard requirements is 1500 by 800. So 1500 length. Sorry, I'll start again. Standard requirements are 1300 length between restraint points. So that's from front to back of the vehicle, 1300, 800 width. So from side to side of the vehicle, and then 1500 height once we get to the occupant restraints. So for the tie downs to achieve 1300 length and 800 width, it might not be suitable for a private vehicle that's got, trying to transport other occupants and so on, especially if the wheelchair is not that big. It could be, for example, someone under 16 in a chair, still have a relatively low seated height and doesn't require as much room inside the vehicle to still meet all of the safe obligations. The one thing we do need to meet, so you can lax the width and the length to fit the chair size and fit everyone else into the vehicle. However, the part that cannot be relaxed is the clear zone requirements. So clear zone requirements is the amount of space forward and back of the head that you need for head exclusion. So to be able to allow the body to move in an accident forward and backwards, there is a set amount of space, and regardless of what you've put for the wheelchair position, they still need to be met. So what we find in general is probably within this is, I guess, putting more the vehicle modifiers hat and the standards hat off, is within the vehicle we find 1100 length is sort of the minimum you'd probably ever be able to get anyway, to be able to still take into account the forward and backwards safe clear zones. And it's width really that sometimes can be made less to be then allow for smaller chairs and more children in wheelchairs, mainly in that area. So
I might add a little bit more to that.
Vehicle, yep.
Sorry. I was just going to add a little
say,
bit to
in
that.
the tie downs in the vehicle, there's just mainly the two. So space requirements and weight.
So to add to that, I guess from a vehicle certifier point of view, there's a set of regulations for modifying vehicles called Vehicle Standards Bulletin. And VSB number 14 is a set of guidelines on how to modify light vehicles, right? Now, VSB 14 doesn't have any requirements it doesn't have any, I guess, guidelines on wheelchairs. So then what VSB 14 does is it directs you over to the heavy vehicle requirements. And it says, as long as you meet those requirements, you can meet our requirements. So that's another standard called VSB 6, right? Now, so VSB 6 provides the guidelines on how to apply that standard to vehicles in Australia, right? If that makes sense. So that's where it all gets tied into legislation, and that's what makes it legally required for it to be compliant to that standard in vehicles. It's through these vehicle standards bulletins, VSBs. Now, VSB, what the VSB says in it, it actually says in there, if your vehicle is being used for more than one passenger, so that means if it is a public vehicle or belongs to a community home or something like that, that it's not specifically just for one passenger, it's not a private vehicle, it's more of a public-ish type vehicle, then you must meet those full requirements of the dimensions that Amin's talking about, right? There is no leniency there. So the leniency is actually written into the legislation. But what it does say is if it's only for one person, so if it's a private vehicle and you're buying it, in your Volkswagen, like the one in the background of my picture, for the person that's just for the one person of the family, then you don't have to meet those overall height requirements. You just have to meet the clear zone requirements of the occupant, which Amin is talking about. So that's the difference, and that's how it's legislated, I guess, and that's the wording. And that's how I guess it's been related to public versus private and taxis and all that kind of stuff. Is that in the VSB it specifically says more than one person you do need to meet that height requirement and dimensional requirement.
only one person, you don't need to meet that. You just have to meet the clear zone requirements.
So I've got another question that came from a recent client of ours. Can you to fit more people into the van, can you be tied down sideways, not facing forward, or can you be tied down facing out the rear of the van? I see you shaking your head.
So that one, yeah, no. So no, it can't be done. And that one sort of falls within another standard, which I guess we'll cover as part of this series, which is the wheelchairs as a seat inside of a motor vehicle. They've got very specific testing requirements for it, which is typically frontal. I think introduced in the future, maybe rearward rear impact as well. But you pretty much cannot transport in a way that a wheelchair has not been tested. So if a wheelchair has only been tested in a frontal impact scenario, then you can only transport in that exact way, which is forward facing.
But so further to that, what also is the case is the VSP legislates this standard, and the standard has got a requirement in there for you to provide instructions to the users on how to use it. And in that instruction, there's always a picture with an arrow pointing towards the front of the car. I'm pretty sure it's very clear in that standard about the direction of the travel as well. So even if they crash tested rear facing, unless they change that standard, you can't really travel rear facing, because I'm pretty sure the standard specifies forward facing, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. We hope that the person
that may or may not.
We hope that the person that.
I was just going to say, like, that may or may not change in the future, but it's got to do with the legislation side of things and the crash testing of that wheelchair. In general, it's also, I guess, the way everything is designed. Everything has been designed from the wheelchair restraints point of view, and the wheelchair itself point of view, all at the moment for forward facing. So until that changes, which it could in the future, maybe. We don't know, but until that changes, it'll all be always in a forward-facing scenario. Other than the legality, it's extremely unsafe.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I really hope that the person that sold that vehicle to the person that I'm thinking of is listening to this podcast, because hopefully that's a bit of an eye-opener for them. It's something that shocked us when we saw it. When we actually look at the standards that are out there, there are people that are, oh yeah, no, you just come in sideways, we'll get more people into the van and it'll be okay. It's not okay.
Your body.
And this is also, I guess, a good thing to highlight. Yeah, I was going to say as well, this is also good to highlight, I guess, the necessity for having a standard like this as well. So yourself, I guess, OT dealing with a client, these questions will come up on the field on like a everyday scenario, and then for you to verify, because not all modifications that we encounter are modifications which are new that start from scratch, right? There'll be a hell of a lot of modifications out there where the client has just purchased a secondhand vehicle and comes to an OT for advice on vehicle modifications, and in that scenario, without knowing this standard and knowing the particulars of it, you, I guess, wouldn't be able to properly prescribe that new situation for that client. Another thing to highlight there as well is the standards are I guess they're the clear guideline of what needs to be accounted for when designing a particular device or system with it that humans will interact with. In the NDIS world, which most of us are operating in today, it is all about accountability and ensuring that you've ticked off all the relevant parts, I guess, of the community and regulation that the solution will apply with. So covered here for and one other thing with standards is the compliance doesn't end the moment the vehicle has been handed over to the client, or to the customer, or to the carer, or to the group home. Compliance is ongoing, especially for wheelchair tie downs and occupant restraints. For example, with the tie downs need to be at certain angles, certain distances where you've got, a universal tracking within the vehicle. So if you are not understanding the particulars of the standard, unable to provide ongoing compliance for your clients as well, moving throughout their life in the community. So it is very important to know each area, if that's your area of expertise and sort of the area they're going to be going into. The second part I did want to cover is then the occupant restraints part. So the occupant restraint is then what's going to keep the occupant safe. So wheelchair, weight, overall size, then we can design the space and figure out what standard requirements we need to meet for that. The occupant restraints is probably the more important part, where this is where we're holding the life of the occupant in our hands and ensuring that it's been done in the correct way. In this area, what we want to know is the seated wheelchair height. So that's the seated height of the occupant once they're in the mobility device that they're going to be transporting in. We want to know the occupant's medical or carer needs when in transport, and if they require any behavioural support. We want to know who else is going to be using that vehicle. Is it going to be just themselves, or do they have multiple mobility devices? Do they have a manual chair and a power chair and they need to be transported in both? And lastly, which is more, I guess, not the occupant side, is just travel environment. But yeah, why we want to know those points is to be able to then correctly fit the occupant restraint in the right position of the vehicle, and also make sure it's going to be suitable for that occupant. In this area, I guess that we're working with wheelchair transport, not everyone's needs is the same. Some people might have very, very high medical needs that, due to the way things are installed into their bodies, they might require the seatbelt to be fitted in a different way, or possibly might not be able to wear a seatbelt in the legal standards compliant way. So we need to know that, so then we can design it so that it is as safe as possible still for that person, but then taking into account all of their medical needs while in transport. Behavioural support is also quite important. As we know, vehicle safety relies on the restraints working. So if there is the ability for someone, due to whatever behavior it is, for the seatbelt to either incorrectly be fitting on that person or to be removed by that person during transport, then other things need to be also done within the vehicle to ensure the safety of that person. So overall height when seated in the wheelchair, and medical needs when in transport. And that'll then give us the ability to figure out how we're going to meet the standard for the seatbelts, and what the combination is going to look like for that person.
So what are some of the standards that we've got the height, we've got the size of the person, we've got their medical needs. What are some of the things that need to be considered in regards to the vehicle themselves, in regards to installing these restraints or seatbelts for the client?
Yeah. So when we're looking at the vehicle itself, we want to know what other configurations this vehicle could be used for, so that we can take that into consideration when we're, I guess, figuring out this wheelchair position. For example, it could be a vehicle that's used not always for wheelchair transport, as dual purpose. It could be a people mover, for example, right? And you've got side fold seats, and wheelchair can be there at times, seating can be there at times instead, able occupant seating. Other things we want to look out for in general, I guess, if we've received a vehicle, one important thing for restraints and tie downs in general is just the overall quality of the vehicle. So if it's a second-hand or older vehicle, the engineer would typically look at it, and if due to the nature of it, it might be high rust or a lot of damage done to the floor, the engineer might also refuse that vehicle from having those restraints installed until either repairs are done or other work. But mainly it's just to do with that spacing that we want the wheelchair occupant to be seated inside of the vehicle. Well, actually not what we want, I guess the thing I always like to ask is where do they want to be seated inside of the vehicle, and not for us really saying this is where you can sit, because there's a lot of options a lot of places in the vehicle that can be seated, and further to the front is usually the safest position. I do have, I guess, a list of 6 things which I recommend people for OTs to, well, not just OTs, but anyone working within this standard space, or wheelchair prescription space, or even wheelchair modifiers. The 6 things you sort of want to know about to cover this standard is: 1, overall size of the wheelchair; 2, overall weight of the wheelchair; 3, the seated height of the occupant when in the wheelchair; 4, occupant medical carer needs when in transport or behavioral support; 5, who else is going to be using the vehicle and the maximum amount of passengers that's going to be required; and 6, the transport environment. So where you're going to be driving this vehicle on your day-to-day environment. If you've asked those 6 questions, the modifier, well, typically the modifier would be the one asking these questions, I guess, when they're quoting something up for you. But these are the 6 areas that if you've covered those, you should then be left with a suitable and safe transport solution.
Very good. I've got one more question, because sometimes that sounds excellent for prescribing a new van. So when we're looking at building a new van from scratch to meet somebody's needs, when we look at some of maybe the imported vans that are on the market, first registered in an overseas country such as Japan or so forth, and they're imported as a vehicle with restraints for both the wheelchair and seatbelts as well for the occupant in the van, what should some of the key things that an occupational therapist should look at when prescribing the van? I know that I haven't prepared you for this question, but it popped into my head just then. But what should an OT be going into the assessment looking for to see if that van is appropriate for the client in the back of a El Grande or whatever it might be?
So to answer that, what I'd first do, which will pretty much give the skeleton for answering the question, is the compulsory, whether it's compulsory to meet this standard and other regulations that also apply, because then that'll then tie in and sort of, I guess, close the imported loophole that exists, I know, in the market. So the first thing is it compulsory to meet this standard? As Ali mentioned earlier, it's cited within the VSV standards. So it's within legislation. So it must be met. So it is compulsory to meet this standard, sorry. There are certain areas which are highlighted that can be laxed. Now, those areas that can be laxed are purely size-wise areas. No load or testing areas can be laxed. It's purely just the size, length and width and height of where that area is where the wheelchair occupant is going to be sitting, that can be laxed. No other areas of the standard can be changed. All other areas must be met. Is there any other regulations that apply? There are also the Australian, so when a vehicle is modified, however that may be, the vehicle in its totality must still fully meet. And one other thing, so vehicle modified, whether it's imported or local, does not make a difference. So imported vehicle or a locally manufactured vehicle, or a vehicle that's full volume available, such as just like a Toyota Camry, they must meet, no matter how they are, in totality, the regulations of the Australian Design Rules, which are the ADRs, and the Road Vehicle Standards Act. And once they're on the roads, they need to be fully compliant with the road rules legislation as well. So there's sort of like 5 tiers of regulation that that need to be met for a vehicle to be on the roads. And then the standards, if they're cited within any of these, then become compulsory. So a lot of them now overlapping that onto the Japanese import vehicles. The one thing which you mentioned is slightly incorrect, in that they're not being imported as wheelchair occupant vehicles. they may look that way, and that's how they've been designed in Japan, but they're being imported under a different category. So when they get imported, because they're not being imported as a wheelchair occupant vehicle, they do not need to meet those standards once they get imported. Then something different happens. Then once it gets into the hand of a car dealer, then they look at the vehicle and go, oh, well, look, this has a wheelchair space in it. I can sell this to someone that requires a wheelchair transport. And then they then go and on-sell it onto someone that requires wheelchair transport. That person then uses it for transport. And that is where then the incorrect and the illegal practice, I guess, happens. Because somebody is then being, well, there's two parts of it, which one of them is an opinion. I'm not a lawyer, but one of them, I'm pretty sure it's illegal to false advertise something to someone and sell something to someone that it's not. So if somebody is being sold a vehicle that they've been told is a compliant wheelchair access vehicle, but it does not meet this standard, for example, for wheelchair restraints, and the restraints do not have this standard written on it, then that's technically, in my mind, illegal, because you're sort of going against the ACCC. But that's something maybe for the clients and lawyers to get involved with. That's just my personal opinion and advice. Now, so it must meet those standards regardless. And sometimes some people do fit Australian standard restraints before they get sold, but they must be fitted still with Australian standard restraints for it to be legally used on Australian roads with a wheelchair occupant. So if you have received the vehicle and you've been sold the vehicle that you've been told is suitable for wheelchair access, and it doesn't have Australian standard restraints, the first point of call I always tell everyone is go back to who sold it to you and ask them to either rectify the situation or provide you a refund because they've sold you something that's not a wheelchair access vehicle that's Australian roads compliant. B, which is usually what happens in the market, is go and consult with your local vehicle modifier and ask for the Australian restraints to be retrofitted to that vehicle. It's something that happens quite common in the industry. Is we'll get a Japanese import vehicle, they'll have the restraints in there, remove those restraints, refit with Australian standard restraints, and refit a 3-point seatbelt, and then it becomes compliant to the standard. So I guess the thing is that the vehicles, they can be used as long as they are retrofitted with Australian standard restraints. As they are imported from factory, from Japan here, they are non-compliant if they're being used for wheelchair transport.
All right. So
I'm going to add a little bit more to that. And do a self-plug. I've got about 3 or 4 Q&A videos on YouTube, on our YouTube, just on this very topic.
Yep.
I'll maybe give a very, very simple version of what Amin said for OTs to look out for. The vehicle that comes from Japan is a modified vehicle. It's not a factory vehicle. It's still modified in Japan, right? It's got Toyota written on it, but it's still a modified vehicle. All modified vehicles must be certified. All modified vehicles must be certified. If you have a Japanese import vehicle without a certificate for the tie downs, then you can't use them because it's a modified vehicle that doesn't have a certificate for the tie downs. Very simple. And then if there is a certificate for the tie downs, then what Amin said would have happened, where they would have had new retractors put in. They would have had it would have had an engineer assess it against the Australian standards, and then whatever needed to be changed in that car would have been changed and certified. But the big misconception is that people think these are some kind of glorious, immaculate factory vehicle. They're not. They're a modified vehicle that was modified in Japan. Like it's if that makes sense. So the modification still needs to be certified, and that's the really big important thing. So to make the job of the OT easy, what do they look out for? The certificate and the paperwork. And if it's not there, then I guess to build on what Amin was saying, if there's not a certificate there, and then you go and look at the car and all you see is Japanese stuff and nothing Australian that meets Australian standards, then that's a couple of red flags for you right there that something's majorly wrong. You know,
is the compliance plate the little tag that is punched into the inside of a door normally.
Yep.
Is that enough to go by?
No. That verifies to you that it's a compliant car in Australia. But I think that's the big misconception that there is in the market, because that car comes in as a Toyota well cab, right? And well cab is the Japanese word that they use for wheelchair access vehicles. Like we've got WAV over here, they call it well cab. That's just what it is. For some odd reason, the culture here seems to be that people think well cab is to do with like a model or something like that, but it's more like a marketing. And so these things come in as a well cab. And so people think it's a factory like, item, but they're not. They're modified. They're like aftermarket products that go into there. To these things. They're still a modified vehicle. So that's the big misconception. The plate just says it's a Tarago, for example, that can be used, but it doesn't talk about the wheelchair access part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those certificates should be with the logbook and service book. Yeah.
And in some states, the state authority issues the certificate. But either way, you have to have some authority figure from your state government that represents the road authorities, give you some kind of authority to use that device. And it's in paper and it's always attached to the rego or something like that.
Yeah, excellent
advice.
And
that's what I was also going to mention with the areas of the standard, which I guess throughout this podcast that I've said can be relaxed. For those, it is always best to consult with your local engineering certifier or state transport authority, depending on the state where you are, where the certifiers aren't, to confirm prior to going ahead with the conversion or for going ahead with that scenario in the vehicle. Because it also does what one state might relax or interpret as relaxed, another state might not. Which I guess ourselves from the non-standards and vehicle modifier hat we put on, we have come across issues like that from state to state. So it is very important. I guess even us, we're engineers. We've got engineers within, and we still get into those same issues. So always consult with the relevant engineer that's suitable for that state. And each state has a different way of doing it.
So if the OT has checked off those things and it looks like it's got certificates to meet engineering requirements, or maybe it's an Australian designed modification to start off with and it met all of those type of things, and they're buying a second-hand car, what should the OT look out for in regards to the seatbelt and matching the client to the space? Is there anything from an engineer's point of view that we really need, and these standards that we really should be considering for something that has been installed correctly, but also using it now correctly into the future? The things that I'm kind of thinking about is where the 3-point harness, this lap sash seatbelt, should actually be placed on the client, just to give a bit of reference.
Yeah. So what I'd say is, firstly, before going into like the particulars, the same 6 things which I mentioned would apply still for second-hand vehicles. So new or second-hand, you should always be going through the exact same methodology. So overall size of the chair, because now you're a different occupant to what that private vehicle was originally designed for, if it wasn't sold to you originally. So you need to going to make sure it's going to work for all of what you have. So the same thing, clear zone requirements may change. If your wheelchair is slightly different, those could change. As a quick tip for occupant restraints into the vehicle, so say we've got the wheelchair part sorted, it's a second-hand vehicle, we've set the wheelchair in, we know that it fits within the restraint points, it's tied down correctly, then we want to put the occupant belt on. Occupant belt needs to sit on the hard bony part of the shoulder. So I might just stand up here a little bit. So
for the OTs or people that are out there, on your clavicle, on your collarbone. Yep.
And closer to where your neck meets your shoulder than to, sorry, your neck meets your collar than to the side of your shoulder. Again, here we're sort of taking the strongest part. And I guess the way I like to explain it is sort of you're making a choice on, if you do get into an accident, what part do you want to break? Do you want to break, something's going to break. So do you want it to break this part, your neck, or do you want it to be shoulder, ribs, and other things combined coming into each other? I'm not a doctor myself, but I'm pretty sure this is the hardest and strongest part in that area. And other than that, it's a part that if it does break, repairing it is a bit easier than repairing other parts that can break. So that's usually how I want to explain it. So hard bony part of the shoulder, closest to the neck, but not on the neck, evenly across the body, and then from hip to hip, going on the front part of your pelvic bone. So I guess, maybe I can use the COVID weight excuse at the moment. I got a bit of extra COVID weight on. So what I want to do when I get into a car is I want to lift my belly up, and I want to put the seatbelt underneath my belly so that it's on the hard bony part of my body and it's not over my belly. The reason, again, is you're choosing what do you want to damage in the case of an accident. Above your pelvic bone and below your ribs is no protection at all, and it's I guess quite a lot of vital organs as well which are there. So we don't want something ripping straight into that area. We want it to go across the hard bony parts of our bodies. So yeah, so from shoulder evenly across the body, hip to hip, and across the front of the pelvic bone.
And it's important to highlight because it's very common for wheelchair occupants to be overweight and have that extra belly fat. So yeah, it's just, I guess, be vigilant around that.
The other thing about that
also in wheelchairs. Sorry, I was just going to say, also with wheelchairs, the arm rests of the wheelchairs are sometimes try to get into the way. And people will, instead of trying to feed it the right way or removing armrest, they'll put it over the armrest. And again, if that armrest height typically will be somewhere, exactly in that area. So it's not the area at all where the seatbelt needs to sit. It's also, other than being unsafe and over there as well, is you're now there's a term, I guess, with belts inside a vehicle called submarining. Now, a seat belt is designed to, if it's fitted in the way that I mentioned, from bone to hip, it is an automatic anti-submarining device. Because of the shape and the contour of your body and the shape of the seat of the vehicle and the seat belt, it'll automatically keep you in a position as long as you've got the upper body strength to stop you from sliding out from underneath it. Now, if that belt is sitting all the way up near your chest or just under your ribs, that submarining function of the belt also gets removed. So you're much more likely to slip underneath the belt, and then it's going to ride up and cause then a choking hazard as well. So, it must always be in that position to make sure that the seatbelt is effectively and safely doing what it needs to do.
And some older vans have just got, especially here in South Australia, just the lap belt, like the 1970s cars in the back seat where it just had the lap belt only. Sometimes wheelchair accessible vans have just got a lap belt only. Where does that sit with the current regulations?
Non-compliant.
Yeah, so
I knew the answer.
So I guess it's a bit, well, it's also, I guess there's a little bit gray. It depends on when the restraints were fitted to the vehicle and the age of the vehicle. So it's sort of, for example, say it's a 20-year-old wheelchair access vehicle, and that's how it's been designed then, and nothing's changed till now. Put aside the fact that the restraints are now 10 years old and the manufacturers sort of wipe liability on it, but let's just say everything's pristine and perfect restraints inside of the vehicle. Legally, the car can be lap belt compliant. Now, the question, well, there's two things I guess I always ask is one is, how does everyone in a vehicle transport today? How does every able-bodied occupant in a vehicle transport today? if you are I'm going to try and, I guess, say this in a way that's as sensitive as possible, but if you're in the community and you're a minority and how things are happening to you are different to the majority, question why that is, because the majority of people transporting in a vehicle are able-bodied and they have a 3-point retractable seatbelt. The minority of people transporting in a vehicle are wheelchair accessible occupants and typically have been left with a lap-only belt. Why that's been the case, like there's a lot of discrimination arguments we can sort of bring about here, but you want to have a look at how the majority are being transported, because that is what they are, that is how regulations and standards and everything have been designed for. And if how you are being transported is different, question it and make sure that it changes to how everybody else is transported inside of the vehicle, because it is that is like the part, I guess, which irks me the most is the question always arises around wheelchair transport. The question, why is no able-bodied occupant asking to be transported in a lap-only belt inside of a vehicle? That's the question I always want to ask, because it's not safe. And somehow people over the years have interpreted it to be a gray area. When I've read the laws, it never has been a gray area, because an occupant is an occupant inside of the vehicle. Whether you're in a wheelchair or not, you're still an occupant inside of the vehicle. So you must meet all the occupant safety needs inside the vehicle. And the other thing is just Google a video. If you don't want to hear me ramble on any more about it, just Google wheelchair crash testing video and have a look at the difference between a lap only and lap sash. And I'm pretty sure you'll make your decision pretty quickly as to how you're going to be prescribing.
Yeah, I think we'll put a link to that video that you show in the show notes to this one. And if you're interested in seeing that video, go to the show notes, press the link, and just see what forces are applied to a body that comes to a very abrupt stop when they're in a wheelchair, and look at some of the differences between the restraints that we've been talking about in this podcast episode. What I think we'll do is leave it on that note. I think that is a fantastic place to finish up there for today. I really want to, from me personally, asking all my OT questions, I really want to thank you, Amin, for helping us understand that side of it all. I'm sure there's a lot of OTs that have learned something today. So from me personally, thank you very much for sharing all of that information.
All good.
Thanks very much, Amin.
So for listeners,
right. Thank you guys for having me.
For listeners, we're not going to do a summary for this episode because I think there's enough detail in this episode as there actually is from a technical point of view. So we're not going to go into a Ali and Brad breakdown and the nitty-gritties for this episode. What we are going to do is invite Amin back to talk about the other 3 standards that we mentioned at the start of this podcast. And what I'm going to also encourage people to do is to go back and listen to the original interview that we did with Amin, and we overviewed the policies back then. We've repeated some of that information today, but we're also getting into the details in this episode. So again, a huge thank you.
Thank you.
All good. Thank you guys very much for having me.
Yeah, no worries. And as we say in every episode, if you've got any queries about what you can do and what will work for your best scenario, make sure that you get in contact with your local OT or mobility dealer and set yourself up with a trial, because trials really do put you in the driver's seat. And as we've found with this one, make sure they know the standards.
That's it. All right, we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to the Drive Able podcast with Brad Williams and Amin Akbarian. If you like what you've heard, make sure you like, rate, and subscribe. It really does make a massive difference. If If you or anyone you know would like to share a story about driving with a disability, or you would like to get in contact, find the show notes, or find the resources mentioned in this episode, you can find us on Facebook. Just search @DriveAblePodcast for more information.